When you picture the North African campaign of the Second World War, your mind immediately conjures a very specific, almost cinematic image. You see the dust trails kicking up against a blinding azure sky, the angular steel of a Panzer III cutting through the dunes, and standing in the turret of a command vehicle, a man with a pair of British gas attack goggles strapped to his visor. That man is Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, a commander whose very name has become synonymous with armoured manoeuvre warfare. But history has a funny way of letting the romance of a cavalry charge overshadow the brutal, grinding mathematics of war. We love to talk about Rommel the tactician, the ghost who outflanked the British Empire time and time again. What we do not talk about enough is Rommel the victim of grand strategic incompetence. He was a brilliant battlefield commander, operating at the end of a logistical tether that was frayed from the start, fighting a war his supreme commander, Adolf Hitler, neither understood nor cared to win. Welcome back to the channel, where we strip away the propaganda and dissect the raw mechanics of military history. If you want to understand how wars are actually fought and lost, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below telling us which World War II commander you think was the most overrated. Today, we are deploying to the absolute worst place on earth to fight a mechanized war, to decode the tragedy of the Afrika Korps. To understand why Erwin Rommel was doomed before his boots even hit the sand in Tripoli, we have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic map of the Mediterranean. The year is 1940. France has fallen, and Great Britain is standing alone, bracing for an invasion across the English Channel. Adolf Hitler is looking east, his eyes locked on the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, drafting the early blueprints for Operation Barbarossa. North Africa is not on the German radar. It is a sideshow, a colonial sandbox that holds zero interest for the German High Command, the OKW. But Germany has an ally, and that ally has an ego. Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, looks at the map and sees an opportunity to resurrect the Roman Empire. Italy already controls Libya, and right next door is Egypt, a British protectorate. Egypt is not just sand and pyramids, it is the geographic jackpot of the British Empire, because it contains the Suez Canal. If you control the Suez, you control the maritime highway to India. You cut the British supply lines in half, and you open the back door to the oil fields of the Middle East. It is the ultimate choke point. Think of it like the Anaconda Plan during the American Civil War, when the Union Navy blockaded the Confederacy and seized the Mississippi River to cut the South in two. Mussolini wants to play Winfield Scott, so in September 1940 he orders his 10th Army, commanded by Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, to cross the wire and invade Egypt. It is an unmitigated disaster. The Italian 10th Army is massive on paper, boasting around 150,000 men, but they are an infantry force marching into a mechanized era. Their logistics are tied to their own boot lever, their artillery is outdated, and their tanks are rolling death traps. The British forces in Egypt, known as the Western Desert Force, are heavily outnumbered, fielding about 36,000 men under the command of General Richard O'Connor. But O'Connor has something the Italians do not have. He has mobility, he has armoured cars, and he has the Matilda II infantry tank. In December 1940, O'Connor launches Operation Compass. It is supposed to be a 5-day raid. Instead, it turns into one of the most lopsided routes in military history. The British mechanized forces slice through the Italian lines, hook around their flanks in the open desert, and completely dismantle the 10th Army. Over the next 10 weeks, the British advance 500 miles, capture 130,000 Italian soldiers, 400 tanks, and nearly 1,300 artillery pieces. The British suffer fewer than 2,000 casualties. Mussolini's imperial dream is shattered, and the entire Axis position in North Africa is on the verge of total collapse. This is the emergency that forces Hitler's hand. He cannot allow his primary European ally to be humiliated and pushed out of Africa. Not because he cares about the Suez Canal, but because a complete Italian collapse might knock Italy out of the war entirely and expose the soft underbelly of Europe to British naval power. So, in February 1941, Hitler authorizes Operation Sonnenblume, or Sunflower. He agrees to send a blocking force to Libya to prop up the Italians and hold the line. He does not want a grand offensive. He just wants to stop the bleeding while he prepares to invade Russia. To command this small expeditionary force, he selects a recently promoted lieutenant general who had just made a name for himself, commanding the Ghost Division during the invasion of France. That man is Erwin Rommel. When Rommel steps off the plane in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, he is stepping into a logistical nightmare that defies human comprehension. Let us talk about the environment, because the North African desert is not a neutral theatre of war. It is an active, hostile combatant that wants to kill you just as much as the enemy does. We are talking about a battleground that stretches from Tripoli in western Libya to Alexandria in Egypt, a distance of roughly 1,200 miles. To put that in perspective for an American audience, that is the distance from New York City to Omaha, Nebraska. There is only one paved road, the Via Balbia, which hugs the Mediterranean coast. If you step off that road, you are in the deep desert. It is a featureless ocean of gravel, jagged limestone escarpments, and soft, shifting sand seas that can swallow a truck whole. The temperature swings are violently extreme. During the day, the mercury can easily hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the steel hull of a buttoned-up tank, it can reach 140 degrees. Men are baking alive, suffering from heat stroke, dehydration, and dysentery. The water is scarce, usually drawn from brackish coastal wells, and it tastes like sulfur and salt. At night, the desert bleeds heat so rapidly that temperatures can plummet to near freezing. But the absolute worst enemy is the sand. It is not like beach sand. It is a fine, powdery grit, almost like talcum powder, whipped up by fiercely hot southern winds called the Ghibli. This sand gets into everything. It gets into the actions of rifles, it gets into the rations, and most critically, it gets into the internal combustion engines. A tank engine that might run for thousands of miles in the green fields of Europe will choke and die in a few hundred miles in North Africa if the air filters are not constantly cleaned and replaced. How do you supply a mechanized army in this environment? You need ports. The Axis forces have Tripoli, which is a decent deep-water port, but it is located in the far west of Libya. As Rommel pushes east toward Egypt, his supply lines stretch like a rubber band. By the time he is fighting near the Egyptian border, his supplies have to be unloaded in Tripoli and then driven over 1,000 miles down a single, vulnerable coastal road to reach the front. Imagine trying to supply a modern armored division fighting in Denver, Colorado, by unloading cargo ships in Los Angeles and driving it all over a single-lane highway while enemy aircraft bomb your convoys every step of the way. It is a mathematical impossibility. A standard German Panzer division in 1941 required roughly 350 tons of supplies every single day just to conduct basic operations. That includes fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and water. When engaged in heavy combat, that requirement spikes to over 500 tons a day. And this brings us to the fatal flaw in Hitler's strategic vision. The German war machine was designed for continental warfare. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on the European railway network to move bulk supplies. But in North Africa, there are no railways. Everything must be moved by truck. The Deutsches Afrikakorps, or DAK, never had enough trucks. They were constantly cannibalizing captured British Bedford trucks just to keep their logistics moving. But before the supplies even get to the trucks in Tripoli, they have to cross the Mediterranean Sea from Italy. This is where the British hold the ultimate trump card. Right in the middle of the Axis supply route, sitting like an unsinkable aircraft carrier, is the tiny island of Malta. Malta is a British fortress. From its airfields and naval bases, Royal Air Force bombers and Royal Navy submarines launch relentless attacks on Axis shipping convoys trying to cross from Naples to Tripoli. The casualty rate for Axis merchant shipping is catastrophic. In some months, over 50% of the supplies destined for Rommel end up at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Tanks, artillery shells, and millions of gallons of precious aviation fuel are lost before they ever see the desert. Hitler and the German High Command refuse to allocate the resources necessary to capture Malta. They view it as a distraction from the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union. This is equivalent to the United States trying to fight the Pacific War without securing forward bases like Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima. If you do not control the sea lanes, your ground forces will eventually starve. Rommel is expected to fight a war of high-speed maneuver with a fuel gauge that is constantly hovering on empty. Now, let us look at the tools Rommel had at his disposal, because the myth of the invincible Afrika Korps often ignores the reality of their order of battle. When Rommel first arrives, his command consists primarily of the 5th Light Division, which would later be reorganized and renamed the 21st Panzer Division. A few months later, they are joined by the 15th Panzer Division. These two divisions form the steel core of the DAK. The primary striking arm of these divisions is the Panzerkampfwagen III, or Panzer III. In early 1941, these tanks are mostly the Ausführung F and G models. They weigh around 44,000 pounds and are powered by a Maybach V12 engine, generating roughly 300 horsepower. The armour is relatively thin, maxing out at around 30mm, though later variants would bolt on extra plating. The main gun on the early Panzer IIIs in Africa is the 37mm Kampfwagen Kanone 36. It is essentially a door knocker. Against the heavy armour of British infantry tanks, it is practically useless. The Germans quickly realise they need more firepower, and they begin upgrading to the 50mm gun, which gives them a fighting chance at medium ranges. The Panzer III is not the heaviest tank on the battlefield, but it has 3 distinct advantages. First, it has a 3-man turret with a dedicated commander, gunner, and loader. This allows the commander to focus entirely on situational awareness, directing the tank and communicating with the platoon. Second, German optics are world-class. The Zeiss sights allow German gunners to spot and hit targets at ranges where the British are still guessing. Third, every German tank has a 2-way radio. In the dust and chaos of a desert tank battle, communication is life. The Germans fight as a coordinated pack, while their enemies often fight as isolated individuals. Supporting the Panzer IIIs is the Panzerkampfwagen IV. At this stage of the war, the Panzer IV is not the long-barreled tank killer it would become later. It is armed with a short-barreled, low-velocity 75mm gun designed to fire high-explosive shells at infantry positions and anti-tank guns. It weighs roughly 50,000 pounds. Together, the Panzer IIIs and IVs execute the German doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare. The goal is not to line up and trade shots like 18th-century line infantry. The goal is to use speed, terrain, and concentrated firepower to bypass enemy strongpoints, sever their command and control, and destroy their logistics. But Rommel's forces are not just German. The vast majority of the troops under his nominal command are Italian. The relationship between the German and Italian militaries is strained, to put it mildly. The German officers often view the Italians as a liability, while the Italians resent German arrogance. However, the poor reputation of the Italian soldier is largely a product of terrible leadership and even worse equipment, not a lack of personal bravery. Let us look at the Italian Ariete Armoured Division. Their primary tank is the Fiat Ansaldo M1340. It weighs about 30,000 pounds and is armed with a 47mm gun. But the armour is riveted, not welded. When an enemy armour-piercing shell strikes the M13, even if it does not penetrate, the kinetic shockwave can shear the rivets off the inside of the hull, turning them into lethal steel projectiles that bounce around the crew compartment. The British troops mockingly call them iron coffins. Furthermore, the Italian infantry divisions, such as the Brescia and Pavia, are largely unmotorized. In a desert war where speed is everything, having tens of thousands of infantrymen who can only move at a walking pace is a massive tactical anchor around Rommel's neck. Standing against this Axis coalition is the British 8th Army, initially operating as the Western Desert Force under General Archibald Wavell. The British military establishment is a completely different beast, backed by the global resources of the British Empire and increasingly the industrial might of the United States. The core of the British Armoured Force is the 7th Armoured Division, famously known as the Desert Rats. The British tank doctrine in 1941 is fundamentally divided into two concepts: infantry tanks and cruiser tanks. The infantry tank is designed to move at the pace of walking infantry, absorb massive amounts of punishment, and crack enemy defensive lines. The prime example in the desert is the A-12 Matilda II. This thing is a heavily armoured bunker on tracks. It weighs nearly 60,000 pounds and boasts frontal armour up to 3 inches thick. When the German 37mm anti-tank guns fire at the Matilda, the shells literally bounce off. The Germans are terrified of it. But the Matilda has critical flaws. It is incredibly slow, with a top speed of maybe 15 miles per hour on a paved road, and much slower in the sand. Its 2 diesel engines are notoriously difficult to maintain. Most importantly, its main armament is the 2-pounder gun, roughly 40 millimeters. While the 2-pounder is a decent anti-tank weapon in 1941, it does not have a high-explosive shell. This means if a Matilda encounters a dug-in German anti-tank gun, it cannot effectively destroy it with blast fragmentation. It has to try and hit the individual gunners with solid armor-piercing shot or rely on its coaxial machine gun. To complement the slow infantry tanks, the British field cruiser tanks, designed for cavalry-style exploitation and pursuit. Tanks like the A9, A10, and later the A15 Crusader. The Crusader looks like a sports car compared to the Matilda. It can hit 26 miles per hour, allowing it to rapidly flank enemy positions. But the Crusader trades armour for speed, making it highly vulnerable to German fire. Worse, the early cruiser tanks are mechanically fragile. The cooling systems are inadequate for the desert heat, and the sand shreds their engines. It is not uncommon for a British armoured brigade to lose more tanks to mechanical breakdowns during a road march than to enemy fire during a battle. The British logistical situation is the mirror opposite of the German one. While Rommel is starved by the short route across the Mediterranean, the British are sustained by the longest supply line in the history of warfare up to that point. Because the Mediterranean is too dangerous for Allied merchant shipping, British convoys must leave the ports of Liverpool and Glasgow, sail south through the Atlantic Ocean, navigate around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, sail up the eastern coast of the continent, enter the Red Sea, and finally unload in the Suez Canal zone. It is a journey of over 12,000 miles. It takes months for a replacement tank or a crate of artillery shells to reach the front. But the British have the merchant marine fleet to sustain this massive undertaking, and they have secure deep-water ports in Egypt that are relatively safe from Axis air attack. Furthermore, the British command structure is steeped in a naval tradition. They view the desert like an ocean. The escarpments are coastlines, the oases are islands, and the tanks are ships. They tend to fight set-piece battles, relying on massive artillery barrages and linear defences. They disperse their armour, attaching small packets of tanks to infantry brigades instead of concentrating them into massive armoured fists like the Germans do. This doctrinal mismatch is exactly what Erwin Rommel intends to exploit. Rommel is not a traditional Prussian aristocrat. He is a Swabian, a former infantry officer who won the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honour during the First World War, for his daring infiltration tactics at the Battle of Caporetto. He literally wrote the book on tactical aggression, a manual titled Infanterie grijft aan, or Infantry Attacks. Rommel does not command from a chateau 50 miles behind the lines. He commands from the front. He is constantly in motion, either riding in his customized half-track, nicknamed Grief, or flying above the battlefield in a Fiesler Storch observation plane. He believes that the commander must feel the friction of the battle, see the terrain with his own eyes, and make split-second decisions that exploit the enemy's temporary confusion. When Rommel arrives in Africa, his orders from the German High Command are explicitly clear. He is to adopt a defensive posture. He is to build a defensive line around Sirte, protect Tripoli, and hold the British off. He is told to wait for the arrival of the 15th Panzer Division in May before even thinking about a limited counterattack. But Rommel looks at the intelligence reports. He sees that the British, having just destroyed the Italian 10th Army, are exhausted. Their supply lines are overextended. Their vehicles are worn out. Furthermore, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill has just made a massive strategic blunder. Believing the North African theatre is secure, Churchill orders a significant portion of the veteran British forces in Egypt to be stripped away and sent to Greece to fight the invading German army there. The Western Desert Force is suddenly hollowed out, replaced by green, inexperienced troops who have never faced a German Panzer division. Rommel smells blood in the sand. He knows that in mechanized warfare, momentum is everything. If you wait for your logistics to be perfect, you will never attack. If you wait for the enemy to reinforce, you surrender the initiative. He understands that the desert offers infinite flanks. There are no rivers to block an advance, no dense forests to hide in. It is a tactician's paradise and a quartermaster's hell. The men in Berlin are looking at maps and calculating tonnage. Rommel is looking at the horizon and calculating speed. The pieces were on the board, the sand was heating up, and the desert fox was about to slip his leash, completely ignoring the men in Berlin who thought they controlled him. On March 24, 1941, without waiting for permission from the German High Command, Erwin Rommel orders the 5th Light Division to advance on the British outpost at El Agheila. It is a probing attack, a test of the British perimeter, but the moment the German reconnaissance units make contact, the British fall back. Rommel immediately senses the fragility of the enemy line. He throws his orders from Berlin out the window, overrides the protests of his Italian superiors, and orders a general advance. Within a week, the Afrika Korps captures Mersa Brega, the gateway to the Cyrenaica Bulge, and the British retreat turns into a disorganized, panicked rout. How does a single, understrength German division shatter a British army that had just annihilated 130,000 Italians a few months prior? The answer lies in a masterful, ruthless application of combined arms tactics and the offensive deployment of a weapon that was never originally designed to fight tanks. If you want to understand the tactical genius of the Afrika Korps, you have to understand the Fliegerabwehrkanone 36, universally known as the 88mm Flak gun. Originally designed by Krupp in the 1920s as a heavy anti-aircraft weapon, the 88 was intended to hurl high-explosive shells at bombers flying at 25,000 feet. To achieve that kind of vertical reach, the gun required a massive powder charge, giving it a muzzle velocity of nearly 2,700 feet per second. It was a beast of a weapon, weighing over 16,000 pounds, requiring a heavy SD.KFZ-7 half-track to tow it, and a crew of 11 men to operate it at maximum efficiency. During the invasion of France in 1940, Rommel had discovered that if you lowered the barrel of an 88 to the horizontal and loaded it with solid armor-piercing ammunition, it became the most lethal tank killer on the planet. In the North African desert, the 88mm gun becomes the absolute cornerstone of Rommel's tactical doctrine. The British tanks, particularly the heavy Matildas, are practically impervious to the standard German 37mm anti-tank guns. So, how do you defeat an enemy whose armor is a rolling bunker? You do not engage them in a close-quarters brawl. You kill them from a different zip code. The 88 could punch through the 3-inch frontal armor of a Matilda tank at a range of over 2,000 yards. To put that in perspective, the British 2-pounder gun mounted on their tanks had a maximum effective range of about 800 yards. The British tankers were bringing a pocket knife to a sniper duel. But a weapon is only as good as the tactical framework in which it is employed. Rommel develops a maneuver known as the sword and shield. In a traditional military mindset, anti-tank guns are defensive weapons, kept in the rear to protect infantry lines. Rommel pushes his 88s to the very front of his advancing columns. When the Afrika Korps encounters British armor, the German panzers do not charge in blindly. Instead, they engage briefly, kick up massive clouds of dust by driving in circles or using aircraft engines mounted on trucks, and then feign a panicked retreat. The British cruiser tanks, designed for cavalry pursuits and commanded by officers steeped in the tradition of the heroic charge, take the bait. They accelerate into the dust cloud to chase down the fleeing panzers. Why risk your precious, mechanically fragile panzers in a chaotic melee when you can bait the enemy into committing suicide against an invisible wall of tungsten and steel? As the British tanks emerge from the dust, they drive straight into a concealed line of dug-in 88mm guns. Before the British commanders even realize they have been trapped, their turrets are being blown off their hull rings. The 88 crew could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute. In the span of 60 seconds, an entire British armoured squadron could be reduced to burning steel pyres. This tactic is a mechanized echo of the Battle of Cowpens during the American Revolutionary War, where Daniel Morgan used his retreating militia to lure the elite British regulars into a devastating volley from his concealed Continental infantry. Rommel is using his Panzers as the bait and his 88s as the anvil. Through early April 1941, this sword and shield tactic completely dismantles the British 2nd Armoured Division. The desert is littered with the burning wrecks of British cruiser tanks. The command and control of the Western Desert Force completely collapses. In the chaos of the retreat, on the night of April 6th, a German motorcycle reconnaissance patrol stumbles upon a staff car lost in the desert near Derna. Inside that car are Lieutenant General Philip Neame and Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, the architect of the British victory over the Italians just months before. With the capture of their top commanders, the British retreat accelerates into a desperate sprint toward the Egyptian border. But Rommel cannot simply chase them into Egypt. He has a massive, heavily fortified problem sitting directly on his supply lines. A problem called Tobruk. Tobruk is a deep water port on the Libyan coast. If Rommel bypasses it, he leaves a heavily armed British garrison in his rear, capable of sallying forth and severing the single coastal road that keeps his army fueled and fed. Furthermore, Rommel desperately needs the port facilities of Tobruk to shorten his own agonizingly long logistical tether back to Tripoli. Tobruk is the Vicksburg of the North African campaign. Whoever controls it controls the flow of operational lifeblood in the theatre. As the British forces retreat toward Egypt, they leave behind the Australian 9th Division, commanded by Major General Leslie Morshead, with strict orders to hold Tobruk at all costs. Morshead is a hard-nosed, aggressive commander who immediately sets about turning the port into an impenetrable fortress. The defensive perimeter of Tobruk stretches for nearly 30 miles in a semicircle around the harbour. It is not a single line of trenches, it is a defence in depth, originally built by the Italians but vastly improved by the Australians. The outer perimeter, known as the Red Line, consists of an anti-tank ditch backed by dense minefields and a continuous network of barbed wire. Behind the wire is a staggering array of subterranean concrete redoubts, spaced roughly 500 yards apart. These bunkers are dug flush with the desert floor, virtually invisible until you are right on top of them, and they are situated to provide mutually supporting enfilading fire. If you attack one bunker, you are being shot in the flank by two others. Behind the Red Line is the Blue Line, a secondary defensive ring, and behind that, massive concentrations of British 25-pounder field artillery. Morshead's doctrine is simple and brutal. He tells his men, there will be no Dunkirk here, there is no surrender, and there is no retreat. He also institutes a policy of aggressive patrolling. The Australians do not just sit in their bunkers waiting to be attacked. Every night they crawl out into no man's land with bayonets, trench clubs and submachine guns, hunting German and Italian listening posts, slitting throats and stealing intelligence. They dominate the night, stripping the Axis forces of their psychological security. Rommel, flush with the momentum of his lightning advance, underestimates the resolve of the Australian defenders and the strength of the fortifications. He assumes Tobruk will fall to a swift, mechanized coup de main. On April 10, 1941, Rommel launches his first major assault on Tobruk. He sends elements of the 5th Light Division probing against the southern perimeter. The German tanks hit the anti-tank ditch, fail to cross it, and take heavy fire from the concealed Australian bunkers. Rommel is furious. He regroups and plans a massive, concentrated assault for the early hours of Easter Sunday, April 13th. The plan is to use infantry and combat engineers to blow a gap in the anti-tank ditch under the cover of darkness, allowing the Panzer regiment to pour through the breach, bypass the strongpoints, and drive straight for the harbour. In the pitch blackness of the desert night, the German pioneers managed to blast a small crossing over the ditch. At dawn on April 14th, roughly 40 German Panzer IIIs and IVs grind their way through the narrow gap. But Morshead has anticipated this exact scenario. He has ordered his infantry to do something completely counterintuitive for the era. When the German tanks roll over their trenches, the Australian infantry are ordered to stay hidden, let the armour pass over them, and then pop back up to engage the German infantry following behind the tanks. It is a brilliant, terrifying tactical adaptation. As the panzers break through the red line and push into the open desert toward the harbour, they realise they are alone. Their supporting infantry has been pinned down and slaughtered at the wire by the Australians. A tank without infantry support in a fortified zone is just a blind, deaf steel box waiting to be cracked open. As the panzers advance, they drive directly into a meticulously planned artillery kill zone. The British 25-pounders, firing over open sights, unleash a devastating barrage of high-explosive and armour-piercing shells. The desert floor erupts in geysers of sand and smoke. The panzers are hit from the front by artillery and from the flanks by dug-in anti-tank guns. The German armour takes catastrophic losses. 17 tanks are destroyed, and the survivors are forced to turn around and run a gauntlet of fire back through the gap in the wire. The Easter Battle is a crushing defeat for Rommel. It is the first time the Blitzkrieg has been stopped dead in its tracks. The siege of Tobruk settles into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. The summer heat arrives, turning the desert into a blast furnace. The temperature inside the trenches reaches 120 degrees. Millions of flies swarm the dead bodies rotting in no man's land, spreading dysentery through both armies. Water is strictly rationed. The Germans and Italians are dug in around the perimeter, subjected to nightly trench raids by the Australians and constant bombardment by the Royal Navy from the sea. Rommel is now trapped in a strategic paradox. He has pushed the main British army back into Egypt, but he cannot advance any further because Tobruk threatens his rear, and he cannot take Tobruk because he lacks the heavy artillery and infantry reserves required to crack a modern fortress. His logistics are bleeding out. The Royal Air Force out of Malta is sinking his supply ships at an alarming rate, and the trucks carrying the surviving supplies from Tripoli are breaking down by the hundreds on the 1,000-mile journey to the front. In Cairo, the British command sees an opportunity. General Archibald Wavell, under immense political pressure from Winston Churchill, decides to launch a major offensive to relieve the Tobruk garrison and destroy the Afrika Korps. Churchill has taken a massive gamble, sending a special convoy, codenamed Operation Tiger, directly through the heavily mined Mediterranean to deliver nearly 300 new tanks to Egypt, including the new Mark VI Crusader tanks. With these reinforcements, Wavell plans Operation Battleaxe, scheduled for mid-June 1941. The British plan is to launch a two-pronged armoured assault. One thrust will attack the Axis defensive line at the Egyptian border, while the other will sweep wide into the desert to outflank Rommel's forces and drive toward Tobruk. But Rommel is not sitting idle. He knows the British are coming, and he has identified the absolute geographic key to the upcoming battle. It is a narrow, steep defile cutting through the 200-foot-high limestone escarpment near the coast. It is called the Halfaya Pass. If the British want to move their slow, heavy Matilda tanks along the coastal route, they have to go through Halfaya. Rommel orders the pass to be fortified and places it under the command of Captain Wilhelm Bach, a former Protestant minister who commands a battery of 88mm Flak guns. Bach is a master of defensive camouflage. He orders his men to blast pits directly into the solid bedrock of the escarpment. They lower the massive 88mm guns into these pits so that only the very tip of the barrel clears the rock line. From a distance, the guns are completely invisible, blending perfectly into the jagged limestone. They cover the pits with camouflage netting and wait. On the morning of June 15th, Operation Battleaxe begins. The British launch their heavy armour directly at Halfaya Pass. C Squadron of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment, fielding the heavily armoured Matildas, leads the charge. The British tankers are confident. They have bounced German anti-tank shells off their armour before, and they believe the pass is lightly defended. They rumble forward in a line abreast, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. Captain Bach watches them through his binoculars. He orders his gunners to hold their fire. He waits until the Matildas are within 800 yards, point-blank range for an 88. When Bach finally drops his arm, the escarpment erupts in fire. The high-velocity 88mm shells cross the 800 yards in less than a second. The kinetic energy is so massive that when the shells strike the frontal armour of the Matildas, they do not just penetrate, they shatter the steel, turning the inside of the tanks into a blazing inferno of spalling metal and exploding ammunition. In a matter of minutes, 11 of the 12 Matildas in the leading squadron are blown to pieces. The British attack is completely shattered. The surviving infantry are pinned down under a withering hail of machine gun fire. The British survivors rename the defile Halfaya Pass. While the British are bleeding to death at Halfaya, their flanking force of Crusader tanks engages the 15th Panzer Division near Hafid Ridge. The British cruisers are faster, but their 2-pounder guns lack the range to penetrate the German armour before taking fire themselves, and their tanks are mechanically unreliable, breaking down in the blistering heat. Rommel manoeuvres his panzers brilliantly, falling back behind screens of concealed anti-tank guns, destroying the British armour piecemeal. By the third day of the battle, the British have lost nearly 100 tanks, and Wavell is forced to order a humiliating retreat back to his starting lines. Operation Battleaxe is a catastrophic failure for the British Empire. Winston Churchill is so enraged by the defeat that he immediately fires General Wavell and replaces him with General Claude Auchinleck. Erwin Rommel has just won a tactical masterpiece, defending his positions against a numerically superior foe equipped with brand-new armour. He has solidified his reputation as the Desert Fox, a commander of almost mythical intuition. But as the smoke clears over the burning wrecks of Halfaya Pass, the grim reality of the strategic situation begins to settle over the Afrika Korps. Rommel's men are exhausted, ravaged by disease, and running on fumes. His fuel tanks are bone dry, his ammunition reserves are dangerously low, and the supply ships from Italy are still resting at the bottom of the Mediterranean. He has won the battle, but he has awoken an industrial giant, and the new British commander in Cairo is already massing an even larger, more heavily armed force to crush the German lines once and for all. The British Eighth Army is about to undergo a metamorphosis, fueled not just by imperial resolve, but by the awakening industrial might of the United States. While Erwin Rommel is counting every drop of aviation fuel and cannibalizing broken parts to keep his panzers running, the port of Alexandria is overflowing with a new, terrifying breed of mechanized warfare. The American Lend-Lease program has arrived in the desert, and it brings with it a mechanical beast that will fundamentally alter the tactical geometry of the North African theatre. This is the M3 Grant medium tank. Up to this point, British tanks were highly specialised, either slow and heavily armoured for infantry support or fast and lightly armed for cavalry pursuits. The M3 Grant shatters that paradigm. It is an awkward, towering monstrosity of a vehicle, standing over 10 feet tall, but it packs a devastating punch. Mounted in a side sponson is a 75mm M2 gun, capable of firing both armour-piercing rounds to kill German tanks and, crucially, high-explosive fragmentation shells to wipe out those concealed 88mm anti-tank nests. For the first time in the Desert War, British tank crews can stand off at range and obliterate German gunners with high explosives without having to charge blindly into a wall of tungsten. The arrival of American steel represents a fundamental shift in the economic reality of the war. How do you defeat a tactically superior enemy? You drown his artisanal, handcrafted war machine in a tidal wave of mass-produced assembly line firepower. This dynamic is not without historical precedent. If you look at the American Civil War, the strategic situation in North Africa in 1942 is a near-perfect mirror of the Eastern Theatre in 1864. Erwin Rommel is playing the role of Robert E. Lee, a commander of unparalleled tactical brilliance, capable of pulling off miraculous victories against superior numbers through audacity and maneuver. But just as Lee was ultimately ground into the dirt by the relentless, industrialized logistics of Ulysses S. Grant and the Union Army, Rommel is facing a British command that has realized maneuver is no longer necessary if you have overwhelming material superiority. The new British commanders, eventually led by the austere and methodical General Bernard Montgomery, do not want to play Rommel's game of desert maneuver. They want to pin him down and crush him with a sledgehammer. And they have a secret weapon that Rommel cannot even begin to comprehend, a weapon that strikes not at his tanks, but at his nervous system. That weapon is signal intelligence. Deep in the English countryside at Bletchley Park, British mathematicians and cryptanalysts have cracked the German Enigma code. This intelligence apparatus, codenamed Ultra, gives the British High Command a terrifying level of omniscience. They are reading Rommel's mail. When the quartermasters in Italy transmit the sailing schedules, cargo manifests and routing coordinates of Axis supply convoys heading for Tripoli, the British know exactly where the ships will be and when. They dispatch Royal Navy submarines and Royal Air Force strike squadrons to intercept them with surgical precision. Rommel's logistical lifeline is not just being disrupted, it is being systematically assassinated. Imagine the United States Navy trying to fight the Battle of Midway without knowing the Japanese code, versus Admiral Nimitz having the exact coordinates of the Japanese carriers. Intelligence dictates the battlefield. Rommel is fighting blind, while Montgomery is playing poker with a mirrored ceiling. By the late summer of 1942, the strategic map has forced both armies into a geographical bottleneck that will decide the fate of the Mediterranean. Rommel has pushed the British back deep into Egypt, but his advance halts at a nondescript railway halt called El Alamein. This is where the infinite flanks of the desert finally run out. To the north of El Alamein is the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, roughly 40 miles away, is the Qattara Depression. The Qattara is a massive, impassable geological sinkhole, a blinding expanse of salt marshes and quicksand that sits hundreds of feet below sea level. No tank, no truck, and no army can cross it. For the first time in the entire campaign, Rommel cannot hook around the enemy's flank. He is forced to fight a linear, head-on battle, exactly the kind of World War I-style meat grinder that German mechanized doctrine was explicitly designed to avoid. Knowing he cannot maneuver, Rommel transforms the 40-mile gap between the sea and the depression into the most lethal defensive belt in the history of the continent. He lays over 500,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, a staggered, overlapping nightmare of explosives that he grimly christens the Devil's Gardens. Interspersed within these minefields are tripwires attached to buried artillery shells, and covering every inch of the cleared lanes are the dreaded 88mm guns, dug in and zeroed on the approaches. Rommel is sick, suffering from chronic stomach ulcers, nasal diphtheria, and severe exhaustion. He is forced to fly back to a sanatorium in Germany for medical treatment, leaving his army in the hands of subordinates. He begs the German High Command for reinforcements, for fuel, for the new Panzer IV F2 tanks with the long-barreled 75mm guns. But Adolf Hitler is entirely consumed by the apocalyptic bloodbath unfolding on the Eastern Front. The German Sixth Army is bleeding to death in the ruins of Stalingrad. To Hitler, North Africa is a forgotten sideshow, a propaganda tool that has outlived its usefulness. Rommel is abandoned. On the night of October 23, 1942, the desert sky violently erupts. General Montgomery launches Operation Lightfoot, the second battle of El Alamein. The British open the offensive with a creeping barrage fired from over 800 artillery pieces, a concentration of firepower not seen since the Somme. The earth literally liquefies under the concussive force of millions of pounds of high explosives. Behind this wall of fire, British combat engineers slowly crawl into the Devil's Gardens, sweeping for mines by hand, probing the sand with bayonets while under intense machine gun fire. It is a slow, agonizing, and incredibly bloody process. When Rommel receives word of the massive offensive, he discharges himself from the hospital and immediately flies back to Africa. But the situation he inherits is already terminal. For days, the battle rages in the minefields. It is a brutal war of attrition, tank against tank, bunker against bunker. The British are taking horrendous casualties, but Montgomery has the reserves to absorb the losses. Rommel does not. What good is the finest tank crew in the world if their engine is starved of gasoline and their ammunition racks are empty? By November 2nd, the Afrika Korps has fewer than 40 operational tanks left. The British have over 600. The mathematical reality of the battlefield is undeniable. Rommel, recognizing that his army faces total annihilation if they stay in the trenches, issues the order to begin a fighting withdrawal. He intends to pull his mechanized forces back, save his veteran cadres, and live to fight another day on more favorable terrain. But then the ultimate betrayal arrives via teletype from Berlin. Adolf Hitler, sitting safely in his bunker thousands of miles away, issues a direct stand and die order. He forbids any retreat, commanding Rommel to yield not 1 yard of ground and to throw every gun and every man into the battle. Hitler demands victory or death. Rommel is utterly paralyzed. He is a loyal German soldier, a man who has sworn a personal oath to the Führer. But he is also a commander who loves his men. He looks at the order, and he looks at the burning wreckage of his beloved Afrika Korps. For the first time in his military career, the scales fall from his eyes. He realizes that the man leading his country is not a strategic genius, but a madman who views human lives as expendable numbers on a map. This is the exact moment the myth of the Desert Fox collides with the horrific reality of the Nazi regime. You can compare this to General George S. Patton's furious drive across France in 1944, where his Third Army was suddenly halted not by the enemy, but by a lack of fuel and orders from Supreme Command to stand down. Patton was enraged by the logistical leash, but he was operating within a rational command structure that was prioritizing a broad front strategy. Rommel is dealing with a dictator who would rather see an entire army slaughtered than suffer a perceived political embarrassment. After 24 hours of agonizing deliberation, Rommel disobeys Hitler. He orders the retreat, saving the remnants of his mechanized forces, but abandoning tens of thousands of unmotorized Italian infantry to be captured by the advancing British. The retreat from El Alamein marks the beginning of the end for the Axis in North Africa. The British Eighth Army pursues Rommel relentlessly across Libya. Shortly after, the United States launches Operation Torch, landing tens of thousands of fresh American troops in Morocco and Algeria, catching Rommel in a massive continental vice. The Desert Fox is eventually recalled to Germany before the final surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943. His legacy, however, takes a much darker turn. Having witnessed the strategic insanity of Hitler firsthand, Rommel becomes tangentially associated with the July 20th plot to assassinate the Führer. When the plot fails, Hitler cannot afford the public relations disaster of executing his most famous general. Instead, the Gestapo visits Rommel at his home, offering him a grim ultimatum: face a public show trial that will result in the execution of his family, or take a cyanide capsule and receive a hero's state funeral. Erwin Rommel, the master of the battlefield, is forced to surrender to the political machinery he served. He takes the poison. The tragedy of Erwin Rommel is that he was a 19th century cavalry commander born into a 20th century industrial war. He understood the geometry of the battlefield better than anyone, but he fundamentally failed to grasp the economics of global conflict. He was betrayed by a dictator who starved him of resources, but he also betrayed himself by constantly outrunning the very logistics that made his victories possible. In the end, the desert swallowed his tanks, and the regime he fought for swallowed his life. Amateurs talk about tactics, but professionals study logistics, and in the brutal arithmetic of mechanized warfare, courage and cunning will always be crushed by factories and fuel. Which factor do you believe was the absolute primary reason for the defeat of the Afrika Korps? A. The overwhelming industrial superiority of American Lend-Lease equipment. B. The devastating impact of British ultra-intelligence intercepting Axis supply lines. C. Adolf Hitler's strategic incompetence and refusal to properly supply the theatre. Let us know your choice and your reasoning in the comments below.